everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is the first session of our Modern Change Management Launch and Learn series. My name is Greg Hollis. I'll be your host throughout the series, and let's jump in. So thanks for bearing with us, everyone. Before we get into the presentation, I'm sure you've seen this slide many times, but we have the safe harbor notice here. So there may be some forward-looking statements throughout this presentation. They're based on our best understanding at this point in time, so don't take anything set in stone as it could change.
So there's a bit of a recap first. We've got a lot to cover today. So we'll recap from the webinar we did 2 weeks ago, just to ground us, and because not everyone may have seen that webinar or been on it, and understand where we are in the journey. This is a specific part of the journey we're talking about today. So thinking about it, as I have for the last couple of years, and there's other people on the call as well, like Chris and Cam and Ira, thinking what the first step will be on the journey for people, because we have a lot of features in Change. It's a feature-rich product, and it's a critical product, right? It's a compliance risk process within IT. What we want to see is customers using the features we have within the product, understanding what order to kind of deploy the things we've built into Change to make modern change management work, and really the starting place, the jumping off point for that, the enabler for other parts of the product to be used is change models. So as you can see here, we've got a model-based approach to change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll explore more about that later. Models is not our concept. It's been around for a long time. But this allows us to have new ways of working whilst we continue to use the existing ITIL changes, normal, standard, and emergency. We're not getting rid of them. We're not moving away from them. We're just moving into doing something as well. And that allows us to simplify what those changes look like, technically simplify them from a process point of view, and simplify things for end users as well. And all those things give us the outcome of increasing change velocity, being able to handle more volume, and improving the stability and governance that change leads to. So a lot of you will be experiencing a paradigm shift where, as organizations do digital transformation, as digital products get more embedded into what the business does, IT gets more embedded into what the business is actually directly delivering. We see a need to move faster. We see smaller incremental changes. That leads to a higher volume of changes. As we have more IT, we also have a higher volume of changes. As we have more security threats and vulnerabilities to patch, again, higher volume of changes. And it's talking across customers, and some pretty big customer sample here. It's roughly doubling in less than every year. So the amount of changes organizations are seeing, the volume of changes hitting the change team is roughly doubling every year for all of our teams. And what we're measured on is stability and our ability to implement governance. So we have to move faster, handle more, and be stable, and provide governance to that. Okay, so we have a modern change adoption journey. We'll talk more about the specific areas of this as we go through, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to move away technically from what we had before. So we're trying to stay in line with what the platform's offering. So for instance, workflows have been around for a long time. We've replaced them with flows a while ago. We want you to be able to do that. It's hard when you're working in change because you have a lot of investment in the workflows that you have. Some people will have moved to flows already. We want you to identify and define new change models. Again, that's what this webinar is about. And use the state model transitions and the state-based flows within those models. And then when we've done that, we have the ability to start identifying opportunities to improve risk management, to improve the way we evaluate changes, because what we end up with is purpose-driven changes. So we can start looking at this particular change model we have, the teams making that change, and start looking at how they do risk in that area. So what change models allows us to do, or one of the things it allows us to do, is it allows us to start dividing up our change. But we'll talk about more about that in the next few slides while we're doing a recap. Okay, so we have our ITIL change models, right? We're used to them, we know them. If you're a change manager, you will know these types of change. We have standard change, emergency change, and normal change. And we know the definitions as well. I don't need to spend a lot of time in here, but it's a placeholder to just kind of level set where we are. So these three types of changes define how we bucket change and what the process is around change traditionally within ITIL-based organizations and organizations that are around kind of the ITIL world, the ITIL ecosystem. And we have repeatable change for standard change, low risk repeatable change. And then emergency change is things that we have very little lead time for, or we're doing after the fact. And then everything else is normal change. And that means we have a lot of normal changes. We should have a lot of standard changes as well. They can make things flow a bit faster, but if it's not repeatable or if it's not low risk, then it goes in normal change. And the emergency change, as I said before, is one with low lead time or after the fact. Also, quite often an authorized change fits in emergency change as well. So what we have in the ServiceNow platform around these changes is technical artifacts. So we do things like we have approvals built into our workflows. We have one big monolithic workflow normally for each one of these change types. And that has to handle, in the instance of normal change, a lot of different situations. There's a lot of different types of change being thrown into that normal bucket. And the workflow has grown and become more complex as the change process has evolved. So if you did your implementation, especially if you did your implementation a few years ago, you'll probably be in a position now, and I've seen it lots of times, where your workflow for normal change is pretty huge. And also, because of that, maybe slightly fragile. It's not fragile in operations because you're not changing it, but any changes you want to make to it require a lot of work, require a lot of assurance, and require a level of risk. So with the artifacts we've got around change, we have a lot of business rules that have been built up over time that trigger certain things to happen in the change process outside of the workflow. And we will have templates and we will have a state model, which is leveraged to make the change flow from end to end. And these things are pretty much nailed down for each one of these changes. So we have a nailed down state model, and then we have a workflow that fires, which will call approvals, and business rules will be called. And there are 3 ways in which you can do this, which leads to a high degree of complexity within normal change. So as I said before, within normal change, we have many different kind of subtypes of change. And within emergency change, we have a subtype of change. Within ServiceNow, unauthorized change is an emergency change. So what do we do with this? This means that as the logic around the change, as we implement logic, we have to handle more and more types. And as we have new ways of working, things like cloud infra, things like DevOps, these do things slightly differently. And we have to adapt the normal change process to cater for that. Sometimes we use standard change for DevOps, right? And that's, I think we'd all agree, it's probably not a good thing. DevOps changes are not low risk, they're not repeatable. But standard change is used to catch them because sometimes we don't have a better way of doing it. And we do have a degree of assurance to the left of the change process with DevOps. We have a degree of assurance in the processes they're using and the tools they're using by the nature of DevOps, that by the time those changes hit the change process, we have already done some checks. We know we've done some checks. But what we want to do is we want to be able to demonstrate that from within the change process. So we may need a different type of change. So here's where we come across the concept of change models. So you can see that normal change has become smaller because we've taken the other changes out of it. So on the left of the screen, we have our ITIL change models. It's important to note they're now change models. I'll talk a little bit when we do the demo about the difference between the technical difference between type and model, which isn't that great. But we have our 3 ITIL change models, and you get these out of the box with ServiceNow. So we provide the models for you, and we provide the flows to make those models work, and we provide the states for you. We also have the idea of federated change models, and we do provide some of these out of the box as well. I'll show you that in the demo. This is where you can start to make things more appropriate for your organization. You can start to work with teams that are out there in the business or within IT to create models that work for their processes, that make their processes as efficient as possible. And by doing that, we declutter normal change. So we make normal change more of a target for optimization. And as you can see, as we move things out of standard change, DevOps change grows bigger. We know what's happening within DevOps because we have a model defining it. When they raise a change, it's a DevOps change. We know because the model says DevOps, we know the changes within that are DevOps. And we know the changes within standard change are now low risk and repeatable. Okay, so I'm going to move to a demo now. Hopefully this will work. Hopefully I can switch across to my browser and we can look at an instance of ServiceNow. But what we're going to cover in the demo is how models are different from types, and why you should start using the model field instead of the type field. So there's some actionable things you can do on the back of this call. Maybe start considering them, maybe even start moving with them. Maybe you are starting to move, and this will increase your understanding of how and why we use models. So what are the first things you need to do to start using models? Switch across now. Okay. So we're in Service Operations Workspace in ServiceNow, and I'm going to go and look at a change. So in here, we've got a list of changes, right, in the Service Operations Workspace view. And you can see, we can see the model straight away. And in that model, you can see at the top of the list, we have some OT changes. Don't worry too much about them at the moment, but it's an example of models being used. There are different type of change being done by a different bit of the business that needs to use change management and is rightly using change management to do its changes. But we have normal and standard changes in here. And if I go into one of these changes, so I'll go into a standard change, I'll go into a normal change for this. We can see that we have the state model nicely expressed across the top. So we have the different states that change will flow through. So if you're using change models, this is one of the reasons to move across to change models. This state model, this progress bar, will reflect the states that are in the model and your progress within that model. If I click on the details pane in here, you'll see that we have model and type are both set to normal. So this is important. We're still using the type field. We still have it there. We're still setting it to normal. We also have the model set to normal, so we can leverage our logic to use that field, or our logic can leverage that field. So for your ITIL changes, the type and model should probably for the moment remain in sync. When the model is not one of standard, normal, or emergency, then we need to have a new type of model in there. So we have something like infra, and the type then should probably not be set to normal, standard, or emergency. So from within the type field, the reason for that is that you will probably at the moment have a lot of logic that leverages that type field within your instance. That's in a sense technical debt. So you'll have business rules that fire when the type is something, or you'll have a trigger condition on your workflow that makes the workflow fire when the type is normal. By having a type in there, some customers have found it useful to add a type called model. We can make sure that our business rules don't fire. Our normal business rules don't fire when we have a model that isn't the normal. But effectively, from a technical point of view, the reason we made this change, the reason we didn't just extend the type field is the model field references another table, change models. We'll see that in a minute. We needed to do it for technical reasons. And that gives us a lot of power to be able to leverage things like the state model, things like state transitions within change models. Okay, I'm just going to click on one more model. So in here, or one more type of change, you can see for standard change, into that, it will show us the state model is slightly different for standard change because standard change don't have the same flow. You can see that we're skipping the assess and authorization states. So this is giving our users a better experience. It's showing them where they are in that specific process. It's not showing states that will then be skipped or we won't use. If we had different states, we might go and have a state, for instance, with an application type change, where we're using site reliability management, where we go and get an error budget. That might be one of the states. It might be something you choose to do. That would be reflected in here if you configured that in the model. And again, we're going to have a look at where that's configured. Okay. So now I'm going to switch across and show you some change models. So all I did here was just navigate from UI 16, which is our more traditional interface, struggling for words still there, into change models. This is part of the change menu that we used to use in the change navigation. And from within change models, you can see that out of the box, we have some models. Again, because this is a demo instance, I've got a few extra ones that are in here that have been turned on by another plugin. These have appeared in change models because they're models that bit the business want to use. But for the moment, we're going to focus on the ones that come out of the box with change management. You can see we've got normal, emergency, and standard. We've also got unauthorized change in there. I'm going to click into normal change. So you can see when I load the normal change model, which should be loading now. Second. Okay, it's loading now. You can see that what we do from here is we configure the model. So this is an activity that would probably be done by admins with support of the change management team. It's something you could, maybe in future, as you get more experience with this process could be federated out a little bit to other teams, but the change team want to be in control of what models are available to everyone within IT. And you can see from here what we're doing, and this is important as well, is we're controlling the process. We're not controlling the content of the change. There are some record presets in here, and I'll give you an example when we look at unauthorized change later of the kind of things we want to control for record presets, but they kind of relate to process. So you can see in here, we're setting the type to normal. So this means that for a normal change model, the type is also set to normal every time. And that means that if you have logic which fires off the normal change, if you have business rules, if you have workflow triggers, then they will still fire when you have a change model. You can still continue to use your existing workflows. You can still continue to use your existing business rules. We'd recommend looking at them and kind of over time reducing that technical debt, switching them over to use the model field to trigger on instead. But you don't have to do that immediately, and you don't have to do it all at once. Okay, from within here as well, we have security. So we have role-based access built into the models. This is more important normally with the other models that you bring out, the new models that you implement, because what we can do is we can control who has access to the model. And that's important for two reasons. First of all, it allows us to control generally who has access to that model. It improves the user experience as well, because that will only be available to them. They will only see the models that they're meant to see. If you have someone in infra who's not meant to be, I don't know, raising changes for applications, they will only see the infra change models. The other thing it allows you to do is, from a point of view of a pilot, it allows you to make this model only available to a small subset of your users. So you can be sure that whilst you continue to use normal, standard, and emergency change types and models, if you stand up a new model, like something like DevOps, or maybe something like patching, you can make that patching model available to just a very small team to pilot with, to understand how it works, to keep a close eye on it. And that allows you to kind of white glove your pilot. That allows you to maintain compliance by having people in the loop. So you're mitigating the risk that having that change, that new change model, the learning experience of having that new change model in place, the risk that contains, by making sure that only a small number of people use it, only a small number of changes will be created using it, and that you can have someone watch those changes for a short period to make sure that model of change is doing what it's expected to do. So as you do your pilot, we recommend that you use these roles, these read roles, to contain who can then use that model. So for normal standard emergency, you want to keep the read roles very open. Maybe ITIL and SN change reader is in here. But for the new models you stand up, you may want to consider reducing the group of users who can use that model to reduce the risk of implementing that model until you want to scale it out and make people able to use it. Okay. If we look at the bottom here, the other important thing is we've got model states. So the model states are reusable. Once you implement them on a model, though, once you create a new state for the normal change model, and this is given to you out of the box, that thing is then locked into the normal change. So if I open this up and show you, for the new state, we have a set of model transitions. That means that if I make changes to these model transitions, it doesn't change them for all the changes that use new. It won't change it for the new state of the standard change. It won't change it for the new state of the DevOps change. It will only, those model state transitions will only be available, the changes you make will only be available on the normal change. So we can be sure if we make changes to the normal change model, it's not going to have a cross impact for those other change models. The reason this is so important to look at now, and I'll show you the state transitions in a minute, is you need to visit these state model transitions in order to adopt change models, whether you're using workflow or whether you're using state-based flow. And we'll talk more about what state-based flow and workflow in a minute. So I'm going to look in here. So we have need to assess. So these are the moves we can make from one state to another in the normal change model. We can go from new to assess, or we can go from new to cancelled. I'll open up assess. You can see in here, we can go from assess to authorize, assess to cancelled, or we can go back to new. Interestingly, in here as well, there is something else which you can adopt kind of further along the learning curve. We've got automatic state transitions too. So again, not something to worry about straight away necessarily, but we can see that we have an automatic state transition. That means if a task is rejected, if the assignment group rejects the change, it will go back to the new state. So what we're doing is we're taking units of automation, and we're provisioning them in the model itself. So the automation is directly related to the purpose of the change. So if you think about that, you've got situations like patching, you've got things like app changes, you've got infra changes, you've got cloud changes. How those changes flow what you want to be filled in on those changes, what fields you want to be filled in those changes, and how you want to automate the flow when certain data is captured is specific to each model. So if we go into the state transition conditions, we can see we've got the ability to script, or we've also got some choices about what will happen to this in this state transition. So as we move further on the maturity curve with our change models, we can start using automatic state conditions, and that allows us to take logic out of the workflow, to take it out of the flows, to make the workflow just about the kind of overarching change flow. And then specific things that happen from state to state can be handled in here. That makes your workflow less complicated. That makes it less prone to failure when you change it. It makes it less complex. Making the workflows and change less complex is something that a lot of change managers, a lot of ServiceNow teams talk about. Move back here. So we've just seen that we have state transitions and we can control them. And we can do things like make sure fields are filled in before the change moves forward. And what that does is, again, it improves the user experience for the change, because it tells us exactly what we want to see for a change, what we need to be filled in for it to move forward. And if the right fields are filled in a given state, we can automatically move the state forward to the next state if we want to. We don't have to, but if we want to. So it gives us the opportunity to automate the change flow. So coming back to this level and just recapping again on our change model, we were in a normal change model. We can see we've got the states that you can that you flow through for this change, including cancelled, which you can go to from various ones of these states. We've got the state transitions. The reason it's important to visit these is if you are using workflow or if you are using flow, if you do not have the state transition configured from within here, if this doesn't have a transition that allows you to move from, for instance, assess to authorize, if the workflow tries to move it, it will throw out an error. It will make the change error, so it won't move forward. You need to go in here and make sure that these transitions are correct. And out of the box, the state transitions are in there for you, but you need to just have a quick look at them, make sure they're the things you want to do, make sure if we've got the assess to new condition here, make sure it's appropriate for you. There's not that many to look at, and you'll soon get used to them. But these are units that need to be visited for you to adopt change models, and they will help you to declutter your change flow. Okay, I'm going to go back to one more thing before we head back into flows and workflows.
And we also have a question we want to discuss live when you get a minute as well.
Okay, we will do that in just a minute. So we can do the question now.
Okay, Tushar, I see you're raising your hand here. Let me take you off mute if you want to ask it directly.
I was having audio issues. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So basically, in regulated industries like ours, like I'm in part of, life sciences, pharma, the concern is that users, when they are presented with the option that is an easy, path of least resistance, will use those models as opposed to the model that they should be rightly using. So how do we make sure that we have some gatekeeping control, some guardrails around what model can be used by whom or by which system or by which team? I don't know what the options are. How do we
Yeah,
do
so
that?
that's a really good question. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're only allowing certain teams to use certain models. And so that means that that you should have the right people using the right models of change. I don't think we actually, at the moment, we don't support having restrictions around then kind of what goes into that model. So restrictions around saying you can only put a certain CI in the CI field for this particular type of model. That's something we'd like to look into. But for the moment, those teams that are meant to use that model through the role-based access controls, you can control who has access. So at least the right people, the authorized people, have access to that model. And that's part of compliance, is making sure that you have role-based access, that the authorization for use of a model is there and it can be restricted.
Okay.
The change still needs to go through approval in a lot of cases as well, remember. So
Yes.
So, that's part of the process. A lot of changes will still have an approval step. When you don't have approval, it's either something that's inherently low risk, like a standard change, and that's something that's kind of extant that we have already, or it's something that's driven through automation. So, for instance, the DevOps change, you wouldn't want someone manually raising a DevOps change. A DevOps change is raised automatically through the pipeline. It's beyond the scope of this call. But you would have a DevOps model that has a certain state model to it, has certain logic around it, state conditions, but you would make sure that people can't manually raise that change, that you would only do it through an automation, which would call an API from the right systems. That's assured, and only those systems will be able to open a DevOps change. Does that help?
Yes, sort of. I mean, the other slight fuzziness that occurs is if you have an application that then has all manners of changes raised against them, some low risk, and some high risk, and so on. So we can't really control it by the application. Just talking about, say, maybe ECC manufacturing for SAP, you've got labels on the extreme end, printing labels. There's some changes to labels being made, which are extremely low risk. But then there's manufacturing logistics stuff that is pretty high risk. So if you look at the application service level, you can't control it that way. It's the same thing with the team, which is practically speaking, if you give access to a team to do something, as in an access to a lower path of resistance with less approvals or no approvals, and something else that is more appropriate, how do you stop them from using this or the other one? So I think that's challenging. In that, in theory, I get it. In practice, operating it is a little difficult.
Okay. So we have another launch and learn session on approval policies. And Greg, if you could make a quick note that we need to answer this question in that session specifically with the demo. So when we have changes that flow through, as I said, most changes will still require a level of authorization. Maybe that will happen at more than one step. Maybe we'll have some approvals in assess as well, like technical approvals, peer approvals. Using approval policy, using dynamic approvals, we can look at the facets of the change. We can look at the CIs, which are part of that change. We can look at operational data around it. We can look at anything we want, really, that we have in the system or that we can call through an API. And that can do one of two things. That can either drive up the risk rating through risk conditions, for example, or that can directly make us route something for approval. So we could still have a step that routes something for CAB if it's on a certain system. If you select a certain system, no matter what, for the SAP model, for example, and that's a good example of where we might use a model. If they choose certain CIs with certain attributes on them, we can then ensure that change is routed, regardless of the model they're choosing, into the right approval policy. So what we're doing here is with the model, we're controlling the process that the change follows at a high level, the states that it must go through and what must be captured at each state, and how those states may automatically transition, who can see that model, who can use it, and who can edit that model as well. That's what the right roles are in there. And some certain data which causes things to be pre-filled on the change. I was going to show you that. It's a good example just to go through. Notifications and working quite as expected to there. Let's see, so I'm going to show you an unauthorized change. But anyway, so we can ensure that certain data is captured and filled in on the change, but then we can use approval policies to make sure that it has the right approval. The other thing that we can do with models is make sure that we have the right data captured. So with different processes around the business that are using change, for instance, DevOps, we have test data that we can leverage. We have pipeline data that we can leverage. We have stories and planning data that we can leverage. So what we're saying is if it follows this DevOps policy, we'd expect to see some stories for our commit. And if it does have that, we can allow the change to flow faster. But if it doesn't have it, and if you were misusing that change, your thing wouldn't have it, then it would not flow faster. So there's control by process and then control by access controls as well. So I think we do answer that question. I know we answer that question. So there's how approval policies work. There's also how we calculate risk, and that can drive approval policy. And there's also how we the particular change models give you opportunity to capture and enforce specific data being captured for that change to be able to move in the way it does. Does that answer the question a little bit better? It's a really good question. So I'm just waiting for me to be able to navigate back to models. If that doesn't happen, I will skip back. Okay. we're going to skip back to a recap on this, and I'll cover flows later when my instance is recovered. So we talked about the move from type to model, and we talked about the technical reasons why we have a model field and a type field. We talked about identifying the business logic, which is triggered by the type field. So looking at conditions on business rules. We were going to look at workflows. I couldn't quite cover that because my demo instance is having a bit of a moment. We'll cover that when I come back to do the next demo. But that's looking at what triggers a flow, what triggers a workflow, making sure we don't have the normal change workflow fire at the same time we have a new change state-based model flow fire. We talked about states and state transitions and migrating to them, and the importance of looking at state transitions when you're doing this migration. We talked about role-based access and controlling access to the change. And then we also we're talking about how we make the transformation away from normal change to use models, making it low risk. And we encourage you to experiment and learn with new models. And we talked a little bit about how we can use the role-based access to allow you to experiment with teams, create new models in a safe way, and then scale. This slide really is a kind of takeaway. So we just listed out some of the things that are really important as you start moving from models. So, type and model are the same. We covered that. Start replacing the type, condition, and business rules. Analyze your business rules and workflows and start replacing with the model. We've covered a lot of these already, what I was talking about. So this is really so that you can take it away and follow through this list to help with your migration to models. So we're going to talk a little bit about identifying new models, and we're not going to get overly complex with this. There are lots of ways you can do this in practice, and you will learn your own ways and what's appropriate for your organization. We give you some models out of the box, and we're just going to talk through a few examples of models really to get you started, to get you thinking about where new models would be. Some of our customers use a demand process for this as well. So some of them use a process where people will tell them about ways they can have new models. So you may have the model that's available out of the box for something like patching, or you may find with the example we were given in the question, like SAP, that you want to set up a new model for them because they do some of the work somewhere else to the left of the change process, and it's appropriate to give them a new model. But in these change models, we have different layers of artifacts with the change. So we have things like what states we're using, and models allow the state to flow in a way that's appropriate for that type of change. So it allows us to define a set of states, wire those states together, and use them in a specific way for a specific type of change and control the state transitions. It allows us to use flows as well. I couldn't show you this in the demo, we'll show it in a second. But there's a different way of doing flows with models. And that's because we have different states that can be wired together in different ways. And so we need the flows to be specific to each state, so that if we choose not to use a state, or if we choose to have states that go in a different order, for instance, unauthorized change where the change has already happened and then we authorize it, we need those flows to fire for that state. So end-to-end workflows become very cumbersome, and a lot of you will have experienced this with a normal change flow. Being able to navigate from any given state to any given state between on a one big monolithic workflow is something that creates technical complexity. You need to be able to handle in that one workflow any movement from any state. By moving to state-based flows, which is what we provide out of the box, and I'll show you an example, we can then decouple our flows from the end-to-end picture. We can say for this state, this flow fires, we have these state transitions. From within flows, we call approval policies. So within a state, we will call an approval policy. And the approval policy can dynamically look at data on the change, can look at things around the change and make decisions about how something is approved, and produce an audit trail about why an approval happened in a certain way or why the change completely skipped approval. So it's auditability as well in there. We're going to cover approval policies in a later launch now. And as well, different changes have different structured data. So if I build this out, we can see that things like DevOps have a lot of structured data around them. And by bringing that data into the DevOps picture, into change for DevOps, so it's the actual change that you're raising as your pipeline fires, we get visibility of what was happening with that change, why we allowed it to flow so fast. And we can do that from within the change. So when we want to audit the change, when we want to see why a change was approved, we have the data, not just on the change record, but around it. We have related records like test results, like stories, like commits, around the change. And other areas have that too. So you may find that within app teams, they have other systems, other places where data is stored. And models give you the opportunity to say, in this context, this data is really important. It might be that you want to look at the error budget that was in an application performance monitoring type situation. And you have a specific model then for that will pull that data and allow you to make the change flow faster, because you can pull the data in, you can inspect it with an approval policy, you can have your states that are appropriate to that. It makes the change flow faster. And again, something we're looking at, forward-looking, is the ability to tie templates to models. So the template controls the content of the change. The model controls the process. You will have lots of different types of content, different specific contents for different models. Like with standard change is a model, right? The standard change model. You can have hundreds, if not thousands, of templates for standard change that use the standard change model. So what this allows us to do is create a set of components that we can kind of decouple from the three ITIL change models, and gives us opportunities to use new components, to use new sources of data, to use templates in a specific area, so that someone, if they have, maybe they want to add an IP address to a firewall, we can have a template for that, and we can make sure it only drives through that particular model. So that's something we're looking to do in the future, is tie templates to models. For the moment, templates are strongly tied to standard change as ever. So we have standard change templates and the standard change model, and the whole standard change structure works exactly as it did before within models, the same way as it did in types. But we're looking to maybe extend that as we move forward with ServiceNow releases. Just a little look again at the state flow. So as you can see, as we move through this, as we reuse these different states, we have different examples. I tried to show you one in the demo example, and it didn't work. But you can see for unauthorized change, that's second from the bottom, we schedule, we implement, we review, we close. It's using the same states as normal. It's just using less of them and in a different order. So we're not creating loads and loads and loads of artifacts that we need to maintain. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, for this particular state, for an authorized change, we're going to pick these states for that model. We're going to wire them together in this order, and then we're going to layer some state transitions specific to that model to make that change flow, or to prevent it flowing if it doesn't have the right data. Okay, so change models. So again, normal change model, standard change model. So normal was a catch-all process. And this means, as we said before, that it became, or has become, very complex business logic and workflows. It's a high volume process. So there's a lot of risk of changing it, and there's a lot of things going through it. It's only as fast in a lot of cases as the slowest change moving through. So you may have a system which is where the risk on that change means that it has to go to cap, because if you are in normal change and you rate a change as high risk, it goes to cap. It may be that for that particular type of change that you're doing, you don't want it to go to cap if it's high risk. You want to have a service owner approve it instead. You don't have the opportunity to do that within normal change without making the workflow increasingly complex. That's just one example. It may not apply to you. Normally a high number of approvals, because again, the approval system has to cater for all the changes flowing through normal. It's high maintenance, it's difficult to optimize, because any opportunities to optimize take into account that you're changing normal change, which is a high risk activity. And as we said before, a lot of customers have reported to us that their normal change workflow, the end-to-end workflow, and the logic around it, the business logic, is quite fragile. If you start poking at it, bad things happen, and bad things happen across all of change, all of normal change, which is a big area. Difficult to improve the change experience. We can't say, if you open a normal change, we can't say specifically this is what we want to see, or specifically we want to limit the choices in this particular field to these particular things, because it's a normal change. We just don't know what it is. It doesn't have a purpose. It's normal. It's a catch-all. But if we have a change model, we can start looking at opportunities to say, oh, we have this DevOps data over here, we can pull that in, or it's automatically pulled in. So we don't need to have maybe one of the fields filled in the change. Maybe we don't need to have a test plan because we know it's over here in another system. So we don't make that field something that someone has to fill in. Or we can automatically fill in fields because we know for that type of change, the data is here, we can pull it in. So it gives us opportunities to make the change experience better. And we can show, and I'll show you at the end, for our users in Service Operations Workspace, the change overview page allows us to tailor the fields that they see for each one of the states for each of our models. So we're only showing them from that huge change form that has so many fields on it, we're only showing them the fields they need for that particular state, for that particular model. That works for normal change models, but it also can be extended into other changes where you may not want to see the same fields that are on the change form. standard change. So there is a high maintenance in a high overhead maintaining the standard change catalog, because as changes cause impact and they're in standard change, we need to review and make sure that that particular change is not standard anymore. We need to look at the quality of change within standard change to ensure it's still appropriate for it to be a standard change. Some organizations have thousands of standard changes they need to do this with. Sometimes people misuse standard change, so they will not report failure and they will then cause stability issues, which we don't see as change managers. So it's difficult to impose scrutiny on it, and it's subject to intentional deliberate misuse. And there could be compliance issues as well. For instance, using DevOps as a standard change is not really technically, I think, what we should be doing. And we don't have the ability to apply operational context to our changes. And what by that I mean, you could have something which you want to be a standard change most of the time, but you don't want it to be within a blackout window, or you don't want it to happen when that system is subject to a P1 right now in production. We can't investigate that with standard change because we don't have approvals. So what we need to do is have a different way of doing change. And this is just one example of change models. So an example would be low risk change. So a low risk change sits in between normal and standard. And it is a large amount of change that organizations do. So it's not quite low risk or repeatable enough to be a standard change. Maybe it doesn't even have all the fields you need on the template. Right? Maybe it's just not templated enough. Maybe it's something that occasionally has a risk profile to it. It may be that some teams can do that change without approval and some teams can't. So it may be that a team is particularly good at doing change, particularly well qualified. They can do a change with very little approval, but you want to apply more approval to another team that's doing that change, which has a less proven track record of making the change. So you don't get opportunities within standard change to be particularly dynamic. It's all or nothing. You either do a standard change with no approvals, it's low risk, it's repeatable, or you're in normal change and you can end up in a cab. In the middle, we can put low risk change, and we can use approval policies to drive how that change is approved, and we can incorporate operational data. We can look to see whether there's any P1s right now, whether that change is a blackout window, whether there are conflicts, whether the team have a good success record. So we can drive it through operational context. We can drive approval through performance. We can automate the catalog as well, because if we're looking at these changes and we see a failure, if the change, that particular low risk change starts falling below a certain threshold, or the group doing that change, their success rate falls below a certain threshold, we can start imposing approvals on them. So they have to ask for an approval or additional approvals if their success rate falls. So that means that the low risk change can flow faster in certain contexts and will be halted when we have other contexts that require it to be halted. So it gives us a lot more options than standard change did. But it also takes a load of changes out of normal change, a load of logic out of normal change, makes the normal change more efficient, makes it less complex, makes it easier to maintain. And because we've put these changes in a bucket called low risk, they're identified as low risk. When we make them, if we look back, we know it's a low risk change. We know why approval policies were applied in a certain way. We know why they were assessed in a certain way. So it's auditable too. The hypothesis is that teams will be more incentivized to report failure with these changes because they're not kind of taken out the standard change catalog for one failure. So we may see some better behaviours being driven around change reporting in that area too. So let's move across to a demo. So we're going to look at end-to-end flows and state-based flows. We covered some of the other stuff earlier. And we also need to start looking at what we need to do to use state-based flows as well. Okay. So we'll put some, hopefully, my demo instance for it. Okay. So we are now in the workflow studio. And if we look in here, we can see that we have workflows. So if I go into hit change, so you can see we have within here, we have the different change flows. And if you look at these, they've actually got, for each one of the states, as I explained before, we have a specific flow. So if I go into the normal authorized flow, you can see this flow just handles the authorization step for change, for normal changes. Okay, so in here we can see it fires an approval policy. We've also, interestingly, for those who are technically minded with ServiceNow, we've also got a parallel flow that handles on hold in here as well. So these flows are specific to the states within the flow. So we can chain them together in different ways. If we skip a state, we don't have to handle that logic in the flow, because as you move from state to state, different flows. And you can see, as I said before, we have state-based flows for your normal, standard, emergency, and DevOps models. We also have unauthorized in there as well. So we support state-based flow for the models that we give you at the box. If you want to stick with workflow for the moment, for the normal change model, or for the standard change model, or for emergency change model, you're welcome to do that. We support that. There are advantages of using flow. We encourage you to move towards it. We encourage you to also move towards state-based flow. But we can understand as well that that might be a gradual transition. It might take you a long time, or you might not have time right now to look at the normal change workflow. It may be particularly big, it may be particularly clunky. So here is the normal change workflow. And I'm going to load it up and show you. It's an end-to-end flow. Even this one, which is the simplest one that's out of the box, which most customers will configure when they do their ServiceNow implementation, and mostly this will grow over time. Sometimes this is huge. Sometimes it takes several seconds to scroll left and right and up and down to see what's happening in the workflow. I've had customers as well who only have 1 or 2 people that actually understand it enough to be able to make any changes to it at all, or even customers that I've been to that feel extremely scared about making changes because the person who wrote the workflow is no longer with them. What this gives us an opportunity to do is to make this flow simpler by breaking it down into states, by taking logic like the approval out of it, by taking conditions out of it as well to check for values and putting them into the state transitions. So it's an opportunity to make the normal process, make the normal flow less complex, and just handle what we need to do, the high level things we need to do in each state, in each flow. I'm going to as well have a quick look at triggers. This is important for your migration. So within, you can see in here, out of the box now, we've got the type is normal and the model is empty. So that means this will fire when the type of change is normal and when we don't have a model. That means if you start using change models for normal change out of the box, this will not fire if you have a normal change model. Now, you're likely to have edited this condition in your instances. You're not likely to have a ZBoot instance like this one that's fresh. You're likely to have your own conditions. You need to check these conditions on your workflows to make sure the right workflows fire at the right times. You don't have more than one firing. It's quite simple to do. It's easy to test, but it's something you need to do. It's one of the steps. So as well as the business logic you have within your change, the business rules, the UI policies, you need to check the workflows and make sure that the conditions are appropriate. That's one of the tasks that you have to do when adopting models. And it's a one-time task. Once you've set things up to use models, going forward, things should only trigger off the correct model. One-time activity. Okay. I think one more thing I'm going to show that I didn't manage to show in the last demo. So if I go back, didn't quite work. Change models. I was just going to show you an example from earlier, unauthorized change, of what we meant by content in the change model and process in the change model. You can see in here that the record presets were only controlling things that would always be the same for that model. They're important to the process of that model. So for an authorized change, we want to set the start date to now, because it's now. When we detect the unauthorized change, that's when the change date starts. We have a short description that captures it's an authorized change, and we also set the unauthorized field on the change to true. We would never have an unauthorized change that didn't have the unauthorized value set to true. So what we're doing with these record presets is we're not using them as a template like we do for standard change. What we're doing them is we're setting fields on the change that we don't want the user to have to change or to be able to change later. So these are important from a process point of view. So what you do with models is control process. Templates are a different thing that control the content. It's not a good idea to start trying to control content from within here, generally. Okay, I'm going to skip off the demo now. Back to the slides. Everything seems to have warmed up a little bit, be working a bit nicer. Okay, so just to recap, the model states, as we said before, are reusable. You have a new state, you have an assessed state. we attach them to models, and then we create specific state transitions for that model. State transitions simplify the flow as well. As we said before, when you have a state transition that automates the collection of some data, or whether a change can move forward from one state to another, you're taking a lot of logic out of your workflow or flow for change. And the state-based flows are also reusable. So we can attach a state-based flow, say an authorized state-based flow, to more than one model. You don't need to have a different flow for each one of your change models. If the process is the same for authorized across 3 different models, use the same flow for each one of those 3 different models to authorize it. So some examples of change models. So we're just talking about, what you would look for when you're creating your new models, or what you look for in the out-of-the-box models. We talked about a low-risk change model before that's using approval policy to drive dynamic approval in a very similar way to standard change, but not as rigid as standard change. So it can actually handle more types of change with better compliance, with better velocity than normal change. And we can see in here, we can use automatic state conditions with this to make things flow faster. We can attach tasks to the change. Some of the things we're talking about in here are roadmap items. So, we're thinking about the ability to link tasks to templates outside of standard change. So being able to extend the use of templates so that you can attach templates to models and tasks to templates. And therefore you can start making a more consistent pattern around how changes are used. Because we have heard from you that templates are used a lot within change, or that people want to use templates a lot more. We've heard that you like what we do in standard change, and really we should be using that across more of change. And what that also means is that you have more consistency. So change is better with consistency. It's better if we don't ask people to fill things in, if we just know what they want to put in there. If we help them, it's better for the user, it's better for the change process, it's better for reporting. So templates are a good area for us to move forward in. We want to be able to see how successful those templates are. So possibly, maybe template success scores we have at the moment, standard change success scores, we could extend that to. And putting these change templates into the catalog as well in the future. So looking at a catalog of low-risk change templates as well as a catalog of standard change templates. Again, something for the future. Looking at DevOps change, we have slightly different kind of key attributes, key components for a DevOps change. And so that allows us to drive the change slightly differently. That's why we've got a model for it, right? We're looking at different data, we're capturing different data. Our process is then driven to the purpose of that change. It leverages the data to make the change flow as fast as possible, but to apply the brakes if we don't have the right data, or if something's happening, maybe like a P1 in production at the moment, that means we want to get some approval. We don't want it to flow naturally, or we want to reject the change. So what this allows us to do for DevOps is make sure when a DevOps team promises that they're following certain processes, the guardrails are up, their pipeline is so well configured that they can't possibly do anything different than create great changes that are very stable for you. Move the data automatically into change, examine the data, and if they're doing it, the change flows, just like they said. But what we can also do is by moving the DevOps data into ServiceNow, we also start looking at an end-to-end kind of product paradigm. It's a little bit beyond the scope, or a lot beyond the scope of this call. But what we're doing is we're having visibility of the DevOps data in ServiceNow that then we use for change. It has context far beyond just using in change. So the DevOps integrations are really important beyond the change process. Change registration here, a really important type of change that we sometimes miss as an industry. So what we're doing here is these are changes like when one of your vendors tells you that they are making a change to a system. You don't get to approve it, they're making that change. It may be that you don't want to do other types of changes during the period they're making that change. You need it on your schedule of change. A full schedule of change increases change stability. So in here, we have a specific flow for change registration. We have specific states. We want to skip the assess and authorize and schedule states of that. We want to move it to implement when they're doing it, and maybe move out, so have automatic transitions on date and time, so that we know when the change is being implemented. We know forward looking when it's going to happen. It's in our schedule. There may be some tasks to check they've done it, right? So they've said that they've done this thing. Have they done this thing? You may want to review the change in that way. So we can drive better compliance around change registration and give ourselves a full view of the forward schedule of change. And we can make sure, of course, with role-based access, that only the right people can use that type of change, as the person pointed out who asked the question earlier on. We don't want to make that model available so people could run through their production change for whatever it is without any authorization or scrutiny. We may also want to use it for changes where a lot of companies don't have time or don't have the impetus or have tools for DevOps and other systems like that that mean they don't want to quite move into the paradigm of a full integration with DevOps. These types of changes are better captured as change registration than as a standard change because they're not standard changes. You're accepting that you're not checking these changes, but you have them in your schedule. You know when they're going to happen. It's kind of like we know that it's not a good thing that we're not approving these changes in change management, that we're not kind of intercepting the data, but we accept as part of the process they've already done their checks to the left of where we are, maybe the SAP team, maybe a DevOps team. We accept that they're doing that. And we want to register the change. And it's a very kind of low effort process to put in place to allow you to capture more of what's going on. And I think most change managers agree capturing more data around the change in the organization is better than kind of hiding changes underneath, grouping them together or hiding them underneath other banners like standard change. And just one last slide, which is a recap on the change models. We're just looking at them again. So what we've done is we've taken these change models out of normal change. We've created specific flows for them. We've kept our ITIL change models, and we're moving them possibly from workflow to flow and state-based flow over time. But we've moved them into change models, which then allows us to start running pilots at areas like infra, patching, doing unauthorized change outside of emergency change, which is a great idea. Maybe doing low-risk change, as we went through in quite a lot of detail earlier. So that's the idea about moving to change models. Okay. And I think we're probably better off there just wrapping and talking about, see if there are any questions to answer, because we're getting short on time. Q&A.
We're nothing in the Q&A.
Nothing, no questions.
Or nothing left in the Q&A we've gone through.
Okay, anyone can come off mic then, I suppose.
We have a couple in the chat. Harry or Corey, do you want to come off mute and ask? One sec.
Richard,
raise your hand if you do, and I'll allow you to talk. Okay, Richard.
Are we sure we've got change managers on this call? They're normally quite a vocal group. Richard, are you there?
Oh, Richard, you're still on mute. You can unmute and talk.
Okay, maybe we'll go back to that one.
Okay, how about Harry?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So I just had a question about the federated change models that you were showing at the end. Are those just examples, or are those out of the box ones that are provided through some plugins? Because I have seen in my PDI, I know unauthorized change, I've seen DevOps that comes with the plugin, but things like patching, low risk change, are those examples you're just kind of suggesting, or are those available through some particular plugin installation?
No, there's no plugin for IT change management that we're probably all talking about here. So there's no plugin that gives you any additional models. There are the OT changes we saw before. I won't go into that, but that's a different bit of ServiceNow. The reason I deliberately covered those changes as opposed to the ones that are out of the box is to show you that you can create your own. That's the idea. You can create your own changes for this. And I've been working quite closely with a number of customers, some of which are on this call, around things like patching changes, around things like low risk changes. We did ask a question earlier in the, or had to have a poll earlier where we talked about having content. We want to create more content around this. We want to kind of get feedback from people. We watch to see what models you're using in your instances. If we see a kind of trend around people doing something, SAP seems to be one in there as well. It seems perfectly appropriate. It may be that we start creating some content around these things as well, or that some of our partners in the ecosystem start creating content for change models. So it's something that you can do yourself. You get some out of the box, and we will be looking to provide more content in this area. That's the model, the state transitions, the state-based flows in the future.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
It's okay. Thanks for the question.
Corey? Oh, Corey. Okay, Corey's question was answered.
No more questions. Do we have any in the chat? Oh,
Yes,
we go for
we
it.
have a couple. Carmen, do you want to come off mute and ask?
I think Ian had a question. Ian Baker.
It's, Ian Baker. Yep.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry. Yep. Just a question around sort of firewall changes. So if we're looking at one of our third parties to manage our firewalls,
Yep.
but we'd still want to see a record.
Yep.
So apart from sort of, I don't know what system they use. I think they use Jira. Apart from sort of building an API back in, what template would we use going forward if we wanted just to capture them changes?
Change registration. So you'd make either through an API or you'd enter them manually a change registration model, which, because you're not authorizing that change, right? You're just logging the change on your schedule of change.
Yeah, at the moment we sort of authorize it because we're still partially implementing it, but we're looking at getting third party to implement all of it. So yeah, it would just be for visibility, really. But with
but you want to know when the changes are happening. That's right, visibility.
Yeah.
Change registration is a really good example of a model that does that, and you can make it available via API, so they can log their changes automatically, or you can raise the changes. It's fairly quick. You can say what data you need, and you can automate through state transitions. You can automate the movement of that change as well, because you have things like dates that will key in and tell you where the change is being moved to implement now, or then out of implement as well.
That's great. Thank you.
It's a good example. It's a good question. Any more questions?
Anyone else wants to come off mute and ask? Just raise your hand. See one.
Hi,
Jason.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Hi there. So I have 3 questions. Can one flow call another flow?
Yes.
Brilliant.
You wouldn't do that. I think if you had state-based flows, so if you have one for authorize and one for assess, it would fire on that state change. So you wouldn't have one flow fire and another usually, right? But you can have one flow fire and another flow. Yes.
Yeah, because if you wrote a complex flow that you want to use in multiple states, say it checks something to do with risk, time of the day, CI, lots of complex things, and you could reuse it throughout all your models.
Yeah.
Yes. And then secondly, probably not that important given you can do this, is whether you can have parent flow where you create one flow, a bit like object-oriented inheritance, and then you say, right, you can't tamper with this flow, but if you use it, you can build extra characteristics on top of it.
Ira or Cam, do you want to? I think I know the answer, but Ira and Cam will give a better answer than I will to that question. Maybe Ira, if I put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, not at all. I can jump in. So you can, and your flow can have a subflow. So if you want to share around some common functionality, define it in a subflow, no problem. And then your flows can just execute that. In terms of creating some kind of hierarchy with your flows, I'm not sure how obvious that setup will be, to be honest with you, in Flow. But in terms of creating common flows to be shared around or to be reused, that's absolutely possible.
And actions as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. You can define an action which does a set number of procedures, if you like, but it's slightly more restricted, I would say. But you can definitely build actions as well.
Okay, and then leading on from that, imagine you use an approval model, or you use some element across loads and loads of flows, and someone says, right, I'm going to change that approval model. Is there an easy way to understand the impact across multiple flows, like where it's used, which flows, etc.?
Ira?
So if you're talking about a change model, I mean, ultimately, if anybody modifies a change model, and any of the state transitions in there, of course, it's going to affect any change request that's referencing that model. I would say your model is at the top. So if you're drawing this out, let's say, and how you're designing it, your model's on top. That defines your whole process for your change request. Your flow is just a mechanism, if you like, of implementing your model. Because of course you can do it via workflow as well. You could do it via business logic, but your flow is just a mechanism for implementing. So your flow would be simply saying, if the model is the approval model, and I'm running at this particular junction in the changes lifecycle, let's say when it's in the state of assess, that's the scope that we're looking for, or that we recommend as a best practice.
Can we see where approval policies are used in flow? I think you just have to check each flow, right?
Sorry. Are we talking about approval policies?
Yeah, sorry, approval policies, not models. So
right.
Let's imagine you had a policy which is a director has to approve a change when the shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
And you put that in lots of flows, so you can put a break on instantly, and then someone says, well, hang on, we're going to change that policy. Where is it used in the system?
You can retrospectively check this via the change policy apply table. So you can see the kind of change request that it's hitting. But in terms of where it's implemented, there isn't a straightforward method of doing that just yet.
Yeah.
But it sounds like
I think you can tell what models the change you're using have used it in the past, Jason, by looking at the policy applied